The crack of flesh striking flesh echoed through the oak-paneled courtroom like a whip snapping in a cathedral. Officer Ferguson Broadus's palm connected with Babin Conley's cheek while the defendant stood perfectly still, phone pressed to his ear, his expression unchanged. The room froze for a heartbeat. Then Broadus threw his head back and laughed, a wet, rolling sound that bounced off the high ceilings and the American flag drooping in the corner. "Think you're special?" Broadus sneered, his hand still hovering near Babin's face, fingers splayed in mockery. "Think some phone call's gonna save you in my town?" Babin didn't flinch. He didn't blink. His jaw was carved granite, his eyes the color of storm clouds over an empty ocean. The phone remained glued to his ear. On the other end of that line, silence. Not the silence of disconnection, but the silence of witness, of recording, of consequences assembling themselves in real time. Behind the bench, Judge Reynolds watched with the bored detachment of a man who'd seen this performance 100 times. Silver-haired, black-robed, he was the king of a kingdom built on quicksand and lies. He didn't intervene. He never did. This was how Oak Ridge worked. This was how they made their money. Broadus didn't see the way Babin's knuckles had gone white around the phone, didn't notice the faded scars mapping a history of violence across those hands, didn't recognize the military precision in the way the man stood, weight distributed, breathing controlled, every muscle coiled but contained. To Broadus, the defendant was just another drifter, another mark, another body to feed into the machine. He had no idea he'd just struck a ghost. 24 hours earlier, Babin Conley had been nobody, just a man in a gray t-shirt and dark jeans, driving a Ford F-150 through the suffocating heat of a Tuesday afternoon, windows down, radio playing low. He wasn't looking for trouble. At 36, he'd earned his quiet. Master Chief, Tier 1 operator, call sign Viper. The kind of man who'd done things in places that didn't exist on any map, against enemies whose deaths would never be reported. He was on his way home from a funeral, a brother, not by blood, but by something deeper, forged in fire and sand and screaming metal. He'd buried too many lately. He just wanted to drive, to think, to breathe air that didn't taste like cordite and regret. The blue and red lights in his mirror felt like an insult. He'd pulled over immediately, hands on the wheel, textbook compliance. Broadus had swaggered up to the window like a man performing for an invisible audience, uniform stretched tight over a gut that spoke of too many dinners at the local diner and too few hours at the gym. His buzz cut was trying hard to look military, but the arrogance in his eyes was all civilian bully. License and registration. Babin had complied, handed over his Florida license, kept his military ID tucked in his wallet. No need to complicate things. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. Then Broadus had invented the swerve, claimed Babin crossed the center line, invented the smell of alcohol. Babin had offered a breathalyzer. Broadus had laughed and said he didn't need one, that his nose was good enough. The lies stacked up like cards in a crooked house, and Babin realized with cold clarity what was happening. This wasn't about traffic safety. This was hunting season, and he was the prey. When Broadus ordered him out of the truck, Babin ran the calculations. 2 seconds to disarm, 1 to disable. He could be gone before backup arrived. But that was the old world. That was the war. Here, on American soil, the rules were different. Here, he had to lose to win. So he'd stood there, hands on the hood of his truck, while Broadus kicked his legs apart and patted him down with unnecessary roughness. The officer found the letter in his back pocket, crisp official stationery from the Department of the Navy, an invitation to the White House, signed by an admiral. Broadus hadn't even opened it. He'd just crumpled it like trash and stuffed it into his own pocket, grinning. "You're under arrest." For what? For existing, for being an outsider, for driving through Oak Ridge with out-of-state plates and the wrong look in his eyes. The charges were a fiction: DUI, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, a greatest hits collection of lies. The holding cell smelled like industrial cleaner trying to mask desperation. Babin sat on the metal bench, spine straight, breathing measured. They'd taken his belt, his shoelaces, his phone. He'd requested his one call. They laughed 3 times. The booking sergeant, a thick-necked man named Ferguson's cousin, had said the phones were down. Budget cuts, he'd claimed, smirking. Babin knew the playbook. Isolate, exhaust, break. Make the defendant so desperate they'll plead guilty just to make it stop. It was psychological warfare, small-town style. They thought they were playing with an amateur. They'd captured a predator and locked him in a cage made of popsicle sticks. By the time they dragged him into the courtroom Wednesday morning, Babin hadn't slept, but you couldn't tell. His face was calm, his posture perfect, his presence unnerving. The deputies kept their distance. Something about him made them nervous, though they couldn't articulate why. At the defense table sat Sarah Kimball, the public defender, young, overwhelmed, drowning in files. She whispered apologies before he even sat down, said the deck was stacked, said the judge and Broadus were friends, said if he pleaded guilty, she could maybe negotiate down to 6 months. Babin looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said quietly, "I didn't do anything wrong." Sarah had defended hundreds of clients. She knew when someone was lying. This man wasn't lying. Judge Reynolds had entered like a man late to his own irrelevance. He glanced at the clock, not the files. He droned through the charges without interest. DUI, resisting arrest, assault on an officer. That last one was new, fresh, probably cooked up that morning to justify whatever came next. "How do you plead?" Before Sarah could stand, Babin had spoken. "Not guilty, Your Honor, and I'm requesting my constitutional right to a phone call." Reynolds had waved a dismissive hand. "Denied. You'll get your call after sentencing. Officer Broadus, approach the bench with your evidence." That's when Broadus had strutted forward, chest puffed, report in hand. He'd recited his lies with the confidence of a man who'd never been challenged, described a swerving vehicle, belligerent behavior, the smell of alcohol, resistance during arrest. It was a performance, theater for an audience of one, and the judge was a willing participant. "Your Honor," Sarah had tried, her voice cracking slightly, "there's no breathalyzer test, no dash cam footage, no—" "The court finds Officer Broadus's testimony credible," Reynolds had interrupted, already reaching for his gavel. "Mr. Conley, you're remanded to county custody pending transfer to Sentinel Correctional Facility. 60 days, followed by 'I'm making a phone call.'" Babin's voice had cut through the courtroom like a blade, not loud, not aggressive, just absolute. He'd stood slowly, the chains on his wrists rattling, and Sarah had fumbled for her cell phone, hands shaking, unsure what else to do. She'd handed it to him. That's when Broadus had lost it, had stormed across the courtroom, face purple with rage, and slapped the phone from Babin's hand, or tried to. But Babin had already pressed the speed dial, already lifted it to his ear, so Broadus's palm had struck Babin's face instead, and the line had connected. Now, standing in the courtroom with his cheek still stinging, and Broadus laughing, and Judge Reynolds doing nothing, Babin spoke into the phone. His voice was quiet, measured, cold as a winter grave. "Viper 6, authorization code Alpha Tango 79 Kilo. I am in custody in Oak Ridge. I have been assaulted by local law enforcement in open court. I am requesting immediate extraction and federal investigation. Coordinates to follow." On the other end, a voice Babin knew well, steady, clipped, utterly professional, responded immediately. "Copy, Viper 6. Authentication confirmed. Stand by for asset deployment. ETA 12 minutes. Babin lowered the phone. Broadus was still laughing. Judge Reynolds was reaching for his gavel. Sarah was frozen, confused.
None of them understood yet. None of them heard the clock ticking down. 12 minutes until the sky fell. 12 minutes until a small-town kingdom collapsed under the weight of federal fury. 12 minutes until Ferguson Broadus learned that the man he'd hunted, humiliated, and struck wasn't a drifter, wasn't prey. He was a weapon, and he'd just been activated. Before we continue, subscribe to SOF Stories for raw, cinematic accounts of Navy SEALs and Special Forces, where one moment can rewrite history.
The heat shimmered off the asphalt like a living thing, distorting the road ahead into liquid mirages that dissolved as Babin Conley's Ford F-150 ate up the miles. Route 47 cut through Oak Ridge like a vein through dead tissue, flanked by sun-bleached grass and the skeletal remains of businesses that hadn't survived the last recession. The radio played low, some country station bleeding through static, and Babin's mind was elsewhere, on a cemetery in Virginia, on a flag-draped coffin, on a brother who'd made it through Fallujah and Helmand, only to lose his fight with the ghosts that followed him home. He wasn't speeding, wasn't weaving. His hands rested light on the wheel at 10 and 2, his eyes scanning the road with the unconscious awareness of a man trained to spot threats before they materialized. The speedometer held steady at 48 in a 50 zone. His registration was current, his insurance valid, his conscience clear. The blue and red lights erupted in his rearview mirror like a disease. Babin's jaw tightened fractionally. He checked his speed again. 48. Checked his lane position. Center, clean, no deviation. His eyes flicked to the mirror, watching the patrol car close the distance with unnecessary aggression, engine revving louder than needed. Already a bad sign. He eased off the gas, flicked his turn signal, and guided the truck onto the gravel shoulder. Dust billowed around the cab as he shifted into park and killed the engine. His hands went to the top of the steering wheel immediately, fingers spread wide, palms visible. Textbook compliance. He'd played this game before in a dozen countries at 100 checkpoints. The rules were always the same. Don't give him an excuse, don't escalate, don't become the story. Through the side mirror, he watched the officer exit his vehicle. Big man, barrel-chested, with a swagger that telegraphed authority the way cheap cologne announces insecurity. His uniform was dark navy, pulled tight across a midsection that suggested too many hours behind a desk and too few in the gym. The buzz cut was aggressive, trying hard to look military but missing the discipline that made it mean something. His hand rested on his service weapon before he'd even cleared his own door. The officer stopped 3 feet behind the B-pillar, a tactical position that would have been smart if it hadn't been executed with such obvious theatricality. His name tag read Broadus. His face read trouble. License and registration. The words came out like an accusation, sharp-edged and hostile, before Broadus had even reached the window. Babin kept his voice neutral, his tone respectful. "Good afternoon, officer. My documents are in the glove box. I'm going to reach for them now." "I didn't ask for commentary. I asked for ID." The hostility was immediate, practiced, purposeful. Babin recognized it. This wasn't about traffic enforcement. This was about power, about a man with a badge and a gun who'd learned he could use both to make people smaller than himself. Babin had met 100 versions of Ferguson Broadus in 100 different contexts. Warlords in Kandahar, corrupt police in Bogota, petty tyrants who measured their worth by how much fear they could inspire. He moved slowly, deliberately, opening the glove box with 2 fingers. His military ID was in his wallet, pressed against the leather beside his Florida driver's license. He pulled out only the civilian card and extended it through the window. No need to complicate things, no need to pull rank. He just wanted to get through Oak Ridge and back on the road. Broadus snatched the license, his fingers rough and impatient. He squinted at it in the harsh afternoon sun, his lips moving slightly as he read. Conley, Babin Conley. Long way from Florida, Conley. Just passing through, officer. Passing through.
Broadus repeated the words with mocking emphasis, leaning down so his face filled the window frame. The smell of stale coffee and chewing tobacco wafted into the cab, mixing with the heat. "You know why I pulled you over?" Babin met his eyes, keeping his own expression neutral. "No, sir. I was doing 48 in a 50 zone. You swerved, crossed the center line back about a quarter mile. I suspect you're driving under the influence." The lie was delivered with the confidence of a man who'd never been challenged. Broadus's eyes gleamed with something ugly, something eager. "I haven't been drinking, officer. I'm happy to take a breathalyzer test." Broadus chuckled, a wet sound that came from deep in his chest. "Oh, we don't need that. I can smell it on you. Alcohol, maybe something else. Step out of the vehicle." "Officer?" "Step out of the vehicle, now." The command came with a hand dropping to his holster, fingers wrapping around the grip. Not drawing, not yet, but the threat was explicit. Babin's mind ran the calculations in a fraction of a second. He could disarm Broadus in less than 2 seconds. One fluid motion, trap the wrist, rotate, apply pressure to the elbow joint, weapon comes free. Broadus would be on the ground before his brain registered the movement. But that was the math of war. That was overseas. That was kill or be killed in places where the rules were written in blood and survival. This was different. This was America. This was American soil, American law, and despite the corruption radiating off Broadus like heat off pavement, the system still had mechanisms, checks, balances, ways to win that didn't involve violence. So Babin unbelted his seatbelt slowly, opened the door with deliberate care, and stepped out onto the gravel. He stood a full 2 inches taller than Broadus, his frame lean and coiled with the kind of muscle that came from functional strength rather than vanity. His gray t-shirt was worn soft from washing, his jeans faded at the knees, his boots scuffed but solid. To an untrained eye, he looked like a drifter. To anyone paying attention, he looked like a threat Broadus couldn't begin to comprehend. "Turn around, hands on the hood." Babin complied, placing his palms flat on the sun-heated metal. The heat was immediate, uncomfortable, designed to be. Broadus kicked his ankles apart, harder than necessary, the boot connecting with enough force to make a point. The pat-down was aggressive, invasive, hands moving roughly over his ribs, his waist, his pockets. Broadus was searching for something, anything, to justify what came next. His fingers found the folded paper in Babin's back pocket and pulled it free with a victorious little grunt.
"What's this?" Broadus held the paper up, squinting at the official seal visible even through the fold. "Personal correspondence," Babin said quietly. Broadus unfolded it halfway, enough to see the Department of the Navy letterhead, the embossed eagle, the formal language. His eyes scanned the first few lines and something shifted in his expression. Not recognition, not respect, something darker. Jealousy, maybe, or contempt for something he didn't understand. The letter was an invitation, formal and official, requesting Master Chief Babin Conley's presence at the White House for a Medal of Honor ceremony. It was signed by Admiral Creighton, 3 stars and a lifetime of service condensed into a flowing signature. Broadus's face twisted into a sneer. "Medal of Honor!" He said it like a joke, like the punchline to something obscene. "What'd you do, Conley? Photoshop this? Buy it off the internet?" "It's real." "Sure it is." Broadus crumpled the letter in his fist, widened it into a ball, and shoved it into his own pocket like trash. "I've met plenty of guys like you, stolen valor, pretending to be heroes to impress girls and get free drinks. It's pathetic." Babin said nothing. There was nothing to say. Men like Broadus couldn't be reasoned with. They operated from a place of such fundamental insecurity that anything challenging their worldview had to be destroyed or diminished. The letter didn't matter to Broadus. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the power dynamic. And right now, Broadus held all the cards, or thought he did. "You're under arrest." Broadus pulled the handcuffs from his belt with theatrical flourish, metal jingling in the quiet afternoon. "DUI, resisting arrest, and let's say disorderly conduct. You looked at me wrong." "I haven't resisted anything." "You are now." Broadus grabbed Babin's wrist and wrenched it behind his back with enough force to dislocate a normal man's shoulder. The cuffs clicked shut, ratcheted too tight, metal biting into skin. "Welcome to Oak Ridge, Conley. We don't appreciate drifters causing trouble in our town." As Babin was shoved toward the patrol car, Broadus caught Broadus on his phone, voice low and conspiratorial. "Yeah, Sheriff, got a big one. Out-of-towner. Looks like he's got some assets. Might find something good when we search the truck. Yeah, we're gonna have some fun with this one." The back of the cruiser smelled like sweat and fear, an industrial cleaner fighting a losing battle against both. Babin sat perfectly still, breathing measured, mind already working through scenarios and contingencies. Through the cage separating him from the front seat, he could see Broadus grinning into the rearview mirror, could hear him humming along to the radio like a man without a care in the world. They had no idea what they'd just done, no idea who they'd put handcuffs on. And for now, Babin was content to let them stay ignorant. Sometimes the best weapon was patience. Sometimes you had to lose to win. The tow truck arrived 15 minutes later to impound his F-150. Babin watched through the rear window as they hooked it up, as they drove away with everything he owned locked inside. His phone, his wallet, his life condensed into a vehicle now disappearing into the Oak Ridge impound lot, where they suspected they'd take their time going through it, looking for anything valuable, anything they could claim as evidence or simply pocket. The Oak Ridge County Courthouse squatted at the end of Main Street like a monument to bureaucratic indifference. Built sometime in the 1960s, it was all brown brick and narrow windows, designed more for intimidation than justice. Broadus parked in the rear lot and hauled Babin out of the cruiser with unnecessary roughness, one hand on the cuffs, the other on his belt, marching him through a side door that led directly to booking. The intake area was exactly what Babin expected. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, linoleum floors scuffed gray with age, and a desk sergeant who looked like he'd been grown in the same petri dish as Broadus. Thick neck, dead eyes, a name tag reading Miller. Brothers or cousins, Babin guessed. Small towns loved keeping power in the family. "Got a live one, Tommy," Broadus announced, shoving Babin forward. "DUI, resisting, and assault on an officer. Real piece of work." Miller looked up from his paperwork with the enthusiasm of a man watching paint dry. "Name? Babin Conley. Date of birth?" Babin rattled off the information mechanically as Miller hunted and pecked at a keyboard that was probably old when Clinton was president. The questions continued. Address, emergency contact, medical conditions, all delivered in the same monotone, all recorded with the same bureaucratic indifference. When it came time for the phone call, Babin spoke clearly. "I'd like to make my call now." Miller didn't even look up. "Phone system's down, budget cuts." "That's a constitutional violation."
File a complaint. Miller's tone suggested he'd heard it before and cared exactly as much as he sounded like he did. "You'll get your call after processing, assuming the phones are back up." Broadus laughed from somewhere behind him, the sound echoing off the cinderblock walls. Babin said nothing. Arguing would accomplish nothing, so he stood quietly while they took his belt, his shoelaces, his watch. They photographed him, fingerprinted him, and led him down a hallway that smelled like industrial bleach, trying and failing to mask decades of human misery. The holding cell was 8 by 10, bars on 3 sides and concrete block on the 4th, a metal bench bolted to the wall, a toilet that had seen better decades. The smell was overwhelming. Bleach and despair, Miller had thought when they'd shoved him inside, was the perfect description. They'd mixed it fresh, probably that morning, trying to burn away whatever had happened in here before. But beneath the chemicals, you could still smell it. Sweat, vomit, fear, the accumulated residue of people broken by a system that ground them down and spit them out. Babin sat on the bench, spine straight, hands folded in his lap. He could hear Broadus and Miller talking in the booking area, their voices carrying down the hallway. They were laughing about something, probably him, probably planning what came next. He closed his eyes and began the breathing exercises they'd taught him during Bud's training, back when they'd locked him in a shipping container for 3 days to test his psychological resilience. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. The heart rate slowed, the mind sharpened, the anger that wanted to build found nowhere to take root. Patience was a weapon,
and Babin was armed. Hours crawled by. The light outside the narrow window high in the concrete walls shifted from afternoon gold to evening orange to the deep purple of dusk. No one came. No food, no water, no phone. Just the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the occasional footsteps echoing down the hall as deputies changed shifts or processed other prisoners. Babin didn't sleep, didn't need to. He'd gone longer without rest in worse places. Instead, he meditated, running through scenarios, calculating possibilities, mapping the terrain of what came next. By the time they came for him Wednesday morning, he'd been awake for 30 hours, but you couldn't tell. His eyes were clear, his posture perfect, his face clean-shaven from cold water and the single disposable razor they'd grudgingly provided after his third request. When Broadus appeared at the cell door, grinning like a man about to watch his favorite show, Babin simply stood and waited. "Court's in session, Conley. Judge Reynolds is waiting. Hope you're ready to show some respect." "I always respect the law," Babin said quietly, his voice carrying weight despite its softness, when it's upheld properly. Broadus's grin faltered for just a second, something flickering behind his eyes, uncertainty maybe, or the first whisper of doubt. Then it was gone, buried under fresh bravado. He jabbed his baton into Babin's ribs, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to make a point. "Move!" The courtroom was smaller than Babin expected. Wood-paneled walls gone dull with age, a flickering fluorescent light overhead that needed replacing, and a gallery maybe half filled with locals who looked bored out of their minds. At the defense table sat a young woman drowning in paperwork, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her suit jacket rumpled like she'd slept in it. Public defender, Babin thought, overworked, underpaid, and fighting a losing battle against a system designed to grind down anyone who couldn't afford better. She looked up as the bailiff led him to the table, her eyes widening slightly. Sarah Kimball, according to the nameplate half buried under files. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe late 20s, with the kind of exhaustion that came from caring too much in a job that punished compassion. "Mr. Conley," she whispered as he sat down, the handcuffs clinking as they locked him to the chair. "I'm Sarah. Look, I just got your file 20 minutes ago. Officer Broadus says you were swerving all over the road, drunk, and you took a swing at him during the arrest." She paused, her eyes searching his face for something. This is not a good situation. Judge Reynolds and Broadus go way back. The judge is up for re-election, and he likes to be tough on crime. They're going to push for maximum sentencing." Babin studied her for a moment. She was scared, not of him, but for him. She'd done this dance 100 times and knew how it ended. "What do you recommend?" "If you plead guilty to the DUI, I can probably get the resisting charge dropped. You'd be looking at maybe 6 months, possibly probation if—" "I didn't do anything wrong." Sarah's hand stilled on her papers. She'd heard every variation of that statement in her career. 90% of the time it was a lie. But something about the way Babin said it, calm, factual, without pleading or anger, made her pause. She looked at him again, really looked, and saw something that her pulse quickened. This man wasn't like her other clients. There was something in his eyes, in his posture, in the coiled readiness of him that suggested he was more dangerous sitting still than most men were throwing punches. "Okay," she said slowly, "but you need to understand, Judge Reynolds—" "All rise." The bailiff's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. Everyone stood as Judge Reynolds swept in, black robes billowing, silver hair perfectly combed, face carved from granite and old grudges. He sat heavily in his chair, didn't look at the files in front of him, and glanced instead at the clock on the wall, a man counting down to lunch. "Case number 4928, he droned. State versus Babin Conley. Charges: DUI, resisting arrest, assault on a police officer. How do you plead?" Before Sarah could stand, Babin spoke. His voice was quiet, but carried every corner of the courtroom. "Not guilty, Your Honor, and I'm formally requesting my constitutional right to a phone call, which was denied during booking." Reynolds waved a dismissive hand like he was swatting a fly. "Denied. You'll get your call after sentencing. Officer Broadus, approach with your evidence." Broadus swaggered forward, chest puffed, report in hand. He recited his lies with the confidence of a man who'd done this before and gotten away with it. Described a vehicle swerving dangerously across the center line, a driver who reeked of alcohol, belligerent behavior, resistance during arrest that required force to subdue. It was a performance, polished and practiced, delivered for an audience of one. "Your Honor," Sarah tried, her voice cracking slightly under the weight of futility. "There's no breathalyzer test in evidence, no dash cam footage, no witnesses to corroborate." "The court finds Officer Broadus's testimony credible and sufficient," Reynolds interrupted, already reaching for his gavel. "Mr. Conley, you are remanded to county custody pending transfer to Sentinel Correctional Facility. 60 days, followed by, I'm making a phone call." The words cut through the room like a rifle shot. Not loud, not aggressive, but absolute. Babin stood slowly, the chains rattling, and turned to Sarah. His eyes held hers for a moment, and she saw something there that made her hands move before her brain caught up. She fumbled for her cell phone, fingers shaking, and extended it toward him. That's when Broadus exploded. He stormed across the courtroom, face purple with rage, shouting something about contempt of court and who the hell did Conley think he was. His hand came up, aiming to slap the phone from Babin's grip, but Babin had already pressed the button, already lifted it to his ear, so Broadus's palm connected with Babin's face instead, the crack echoing off the wood paneling like a gunshot. The courtroom froze. Broadus stood there, breathing hard, his hand still raised. Judge Reynolds's gavel hung in midair. Sarah's mouth opened in shock, and Babin didn't move, didn't flinch, just held the phone to his ear, his cheek already reddening where Broadus had struck him, his eyes locked on something far beyond this room. On the other end of the line, a voice answered, professional, clipped, military precision in every syllable. "Secure line. Identify." Babin's voice was winter cold. Viper 6. Authorization code Alpha Tango 79 Kilo. I am unlawfully detained in Oak Ridge County, Mississippi. I have been assaulted by local law enforcement in open court, requesting immediate extraction and federal investigation. Silence. Then, authentication confirmed, Viper 6. Stand by for rapid deployment. ETA 12 minutes. Do you require medical assistance? Negative. I require a federal presence and full investigative support. Copy that. Assets are airborne. Maintain your position. Babin lowered the phone slowly. Around him, the courtroom was still frozen, everyone trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Broadus was still laughing, but the sound had a hollow edge now, like he could sense something had changed but couldn't articulate what. Reynolds was reaching for his gavel again, ready to restore order to his kingdom. Neither of them understood yet. Neither of them heard the clock ticking down. 12 minutes until 3 Black Hawk helicopters appeared in the sky above Oak Ridge. 12 minutes until a team of Tier 1 operators breached the courthouse doors. 12 minutes until Admiral Creighton himself walked into this courtroom and turned a small-town power structure into federal evidence. Sarah leaned close to Babin, her voice barely a whisper. What just happened? Babin looked at her, and for the first time since his arrest, something like a smile touched his eyes. Not humor, not satisfaction, just cold certainty. Justice, he said quietly. Justice just happened. The 12 minutes stretched like taffy in Sarah's perception. She'd handed her phone to a man she barely knew, watched a police officer assault him in open court, and heard him speak in a language that sounded like military precision wrapped in ice. Now she sat frozen at the defense table, while Judge Reynolds tried to restore order by banging his gavel, and Broadus paced near the bench like a caged animal who just realized the cage door might not be as secure as he had thought.
"Bailiff, remove the defendant to holding," Reynolds barked, his face flushed. "Miss Kimball, you're in contempt for providing—" "Your Honor, my client was denied his constitutional right to counsel and communication. I acted within—" "Save it for the Bar Review Board. You're done here." But Sarah wasn't moving. Something in Babin's expression, that absolute certainty, that complete lack of fear, had transferred to her like an electrical charge. For the
first time in 3 years of losing cases in this courtroom, she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. So she stayed seated, hands folded on the table, and waited. Broadus grabbed Babin by the arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Think you're clever? Think some phone call's gonna save you? You just made everything worse, Conley. Now you're going to Sentinel, and I promise you they don't take kindly to troublemakers there." Babin said nothing. He let Broadus haul him toward the side door that led back to holding, his expression unchanged, his breathing steady. Sarah watched him go, watched the way he moved, controlled, contained, like a man who'd already won a fight no one else knew had started. The door slammed shut with a metallic clang that echoed through the courtroom. Reynolds was still lecturing her, still threatening sanctions, but Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She was counting. 12 minutes, Babin had said on the phone. 12 minutes for assets to arrive. What kind of assets? Military? Federal? And how had he made that call with such precision, such immediate response? Unless— The thought was interrupted by a sound, low at first, barely perceptible beneath Reynolds' droning voice, a rhythmic thumping that grew louder with each second. Sarah's head turned toward the windows, and she saw them. 3 black shapes growing larger against the pale morning sky, moving fast and low, their rotors churning the air into visible distortions. Helicopters, military helicopters, coming straight for Oak Ridge. The courtroom went quiet as others noticed. The locals in the gallery stood, craning their necks toward the windows. Reynolds stopped mid-sentence, his gavel hanging in mid-air. Even the bailiff moved toward the glass, his hand unconsciously resting on his sidearm. "What in the hell?" Reynolds started. The Blackhawks descended over the town square like birds of prey, their downwash sending trash cans tumbling and trees bending horizontal. They didn't land in the square, too many power lines, too much civilian traffic, but they hovered just above rooftop level, close enough that Sarah could see the door gunners and the ropes already being deployed. Figures in tactical gear, fast roped down with practiced efficiency, boots hitting pavement in perfect synchronization. They wore no identifying patches, no unit insignia, just black fatigues, body armor, and weapons that looked like they belonged in a war zone, not a Mississippi courthouse. Behind the Blackhawks came something heavier, a CH-47 Chinook, twin rotors thundering, settling into the parking lot behind the courthouse with enough force to crack windows and trigger every car alarm within a 2-block radius. The rear ramp lowered before the wheels had fully settled, and more figures emerged. These wore navy dress uniforms, sharp and pristine, moving with purpose toward the courthouse entrance. The courtroom erupted into chaos. People were shouting, running for exits, pulling out cell phones. Reynolds was yelling for order, for the bailiff to lock the doors, for someone to call the sheriff's department, but his voice was drowned out by the rotor wash and the sound of the main courthouse doors being breached. Not kicked in, not broken, just opened with the quiet authority of men who didn't need to ask permission. The first operator through the courtroom doors moved like liquid violence, weapon up, scanning for threats with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times in places where hesitation meant death. Behind him came 5 more, spreading out to cover every angle, every exit. Their weapons weren't pointed at anyone, yet, but the implication was clear. This room was now under their control. "Nobody move," one of them said, his voice flat and professional. "This facility is now under federal jurisdiction. Anyone attempting to leave will be detained." "You can't just— This is a court of law. You have no authority here."
United States Navy Special Warfare Command would disagree, Your Honor. The voice came from the doorway, and every head turned. The man who entered wasn't dressed for combat. He wore the dress-white uniform of a Navy admiral, 3 stars gleaming on his collar, ribbons covering his chest in a rainbow of commendations and campaign medals. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, with a face that had seen too much to be impressed by small-town bluster. Admiral Creighton crossed the courtroom with measured steps, his eyes taking in every detail: the empty gallery, the scattered papers, Sarah still sitting at the defense table, the bailiff frozen by the window, and Reynolds half standing behind his bench, gavel still clutched in his hand like a talisman that had suddenly lost its power. I am Admiral James Creighton, United States Navy Special Warfare Command. His voice carried the kind of authority that didn't need volume. As of approximately 14 minutes ago, this courthouse became the subject of a federal investigation into civil rights violations, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Everyone in this room is now a witness or a suspect. I strongly suggest you cooperate.
This is outrageous, Reynolds sputtered. You can't just... This is a court of law. You have no authority here.
Where is Master Chief Babin Conley? The question stopped Reynolds cold. Sarah saw the recognition flicker across his face, the sudden understanding that maybe, just maybe, he'd made a catastrophic mistake. The defendant was remanded to holding, Sarah heard herself say, her voice surprisingly steady. Officer Broadus took him through that door approximately 9 minutes ago.
Creighton nodded to one of the operators, who immediately moved toward the door. Within seconds it was open, and Babin was being escorted back into the courtroom. He still wore the handcuffs, still moved with that same controlled precision, but something had changed in his expression. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement that the rules of engagement had finally shifted in his favor. "Master Chief," Creighton said, and his voice carried genuine warmth beneath the military formality. "Are you injured?" "Nothing significant, Admiral." "We monitored the entire interaction. The assault was recorded and transmitted in real time to SOCOM headquarters and the Department of Justice." Creighton's eyes moved to Broadus, who had followed the operators back into the courtroom and now stood near the wall, his face the color of old newspaper. "Officer Ferguson Broadus, you are under federal arrest for assault on a military asset, violation of civil rights under color of law, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." Broadus's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. I had no idea he was... "You had his Medal of Honor ceremony invitation in your pocket," Creighton said, his voice dropping to something colder than Sarah had thought possible. "You found official correspondence from my office, from the Department of the Navy, and you not only ignored it, you destroyed it, mocked it, and proceeded to assault a decorated combat veteran in open court. Your ignorance is not a defense. It's evidence of your contempt for the very system you swore to uphold." One of the operators moved forward with zip ties, securing Broadus's hands behind his back with efficient, impersonal professionalism. The officer who'd laughed and sneered and wielded his badge like a weapon now looked like a child who'd finally been caught after years of getting away with stealing from the cookie jar. Except this wasn't about cookies. This was about lives destroyed, families ruined, and a justice system corrupted beyond recognition. Reynolds was next. Creighton produced a document from inside his uniform jacket and laid it on the bench with a sound like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. "Federal warrant for your arrest, Judge Reynolds. The charges are extensive and include RICO violations, conspiracy to commit fraud, operating an illegal detention and extortion scheme, and accessory to multiple counts of civil rights violations.
My personal favorite is the part where you and Officer Broadus have been funneling out-of-state travelers into a private prison facility that you partially own through a land trust. Sentinel Corrections. Clever name, not so clever execution. The color drained from Reynolds' face, leaving him gray as old concrete. He can't prove. We already have. The FBI has been building a case against Sentinel Corrections for 18 months. You just made it easier by giving us probable cause to accelerate the timeline. Creighton's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. You see, Judge, when you assault a Tier 1 operator in open court while he's on an active line with Pentagon monitoring, you trigger a very specific set of protocols. Protocols that include immediate warrant authorization, asset deployment, and full investigative support from every relevant federal agency. In layman's terms, you handed us everything we needed tied up with a bow. Sarah's mind was reeling, trying to process the scope of what she was hearing. 18 months. The FBI had been watching this town for 18 months, and she'd never known. She'd lost case after case, watched client after client get fed into the Sentinel pipeline, and it had all been building toward this moment. Creighton turned to her, and his expression softened fractionally. "Miss Kimball, you're not under investigation. In fact, from what I understand, you're one of the few people in this courthouse who's been trying to do the right thing. We'll need your testimony, and I suspect the Bar Association will want to hear about the conditions you've been working under. But first," he gestured to the operators, "we have a facility to secure." The warehouse sat at the edge of town, tucked behind an abandoned feed mill that hadn't operated since the 1980s. From the road, it looked like nothing, just another rusted metal building slowly being reclaimed by kudzu and time. But as the convoy of federal vehicles pulled up, Babin could see the signs that marked it as something more. New locks on old doors, security cameras poorly hidden in the eaves, fresh tire tracks in the dirt despite the building's appearance of neglect. He rode in the lead Humvee with Creighton and 3 operators, his handcuffs finally removed, his wrists rubbing where the metal had bit into skin. They'd returned his belongings, wallet, keys, the crumpled Medal of Honor invitation that Creighton had personally smoothed out and handed back with an apology that felt inadequate given what Babin had endured. His truck was being recovered from the impound lot, but that would take time. Right now, there were more pressing matters. "The FBI found the connection 6 months ago," Creighton explained as they approached the warehouse. "Sentinel Corrections shows revenue for housing approximately 200 inmates at any given time, but their actual inmate population, according to state records, never exceeds 40. Someone's cooking the books. The question was, where's the money really coming from?" The answer became clear when the operators breached the warehouse doors. Inside was a monument to systematic theft. Row after row of shelving units, each one packed with items that told 1,000 stories of travelers who'd passed through Oak Ridge and never made it out whole. Luggage, backpacks, laptops, cameras, jewelry, tools, musical instruments, children's toys. Everything organized with meticulous care, labeled and logged like inventory in a legitimate business, because that's what it was to Broadus and Reynolds and whoever else was involved. A business, a profit center built on the broken lives of people who'd made the mistake of driving through the wrong town on the wrong day.
One of the FBI agents walked up to Babin, tablet in hand, face grim. "We're estimating over 1,000 individual victims based on the inventory so far. Some of these items date back 5 years. Cell phones, IDs, vehicle titles. They weren't just stealing property, they were stealing identities, selling personal information, processing fraudulent insurance claims. It's a full-spectrum criminal enterprise." Babin moved through the rows slowly, his trained eye cataloging the scope of the operation. He stopped at a shelf holding children's items, a stuffed rabbit worn from love, a small backpack with dinosaurs printed on it.
Someone's child had lost these things. Some family had been torn apart, their belongings confiscated under the color of law and sold off piece by piece while they languished in Sentinel or scraped together money for fines they didn't owe. "How many people are currently in Sentinel?" he asked quietly. The FBI agent checked his tablet. 23, most for minor traffic violations that spiraled into larger charges. None of them can afford bail. None of them have effective legal representation. Release them today. Already in motion, Master Chief. Federal prosecutors are filing emergency motions as we speak. By this evening, every inmate in Sentinel will be processed for release, and we'll be conducting individual reviews of their cases. Anyone who was falsely convicted will have their records expunged and will be eligible for restitution from the state. Babin nodded, but his jaw remained tight. Restitution. As if money could give back the time stolen, the dignity stripped away, the trauma of being caged like an animal for crimes you didn't commit. He'd been lucky. He'd had the training, the connections, the clearance to make one phone call that changed everything. But the people whose belongings filled this warehouse hadn't been lucky. They'd been prey in a system designed to hunt them. "Bag it all," Creighton ordered, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "Every item gets cataloged, photographed, and returned to its rightful owner when possible. Anything that can't be returned goes into evidence. I want this place documented so thoroughly that a jury can't help but convict everyone involved." They worked until dusk, teams of FBI agents and Navy operators moving through the warehouse with methodical precision. Babin stayed the entire time, something in him needing to witness the full scope of what Broadus and Reynolds had built. This wasn't just corruption, it was predation elevated to an art form, systematic and calculated and utterly devoid of conscience. By the time they returned to the courthouse, it was evening. The Blackhawks had departed, but the Chinook remained, along with a fleet of federal vehicles that had transformed the parking lot into something resembling a forward operating base. News crews had arrived from Jackson and Memphis, their cameras capturing every detail, their reporters breathlessly describing what they were calling the biggest federal law enforcement operation in Mississippi since the Civil Rights era. Inside, the courthouse had been converted into a processing center. FBI agents worked at every desk, interviewing witnesses, reviewing files, building cases. Reynolds had been transported to a federal holding facility in Jackson, but Broadus remained, locked in one of the same cells where he'd held Babin, waiting for his own transport. Creighton approached Babin in the lobby, his uniform jacket unbuttoned now, exhaustion showing around his eyes. "The transport team wants to move Broadus within the hour. Before they do, I thought you might want a moment." Babin considered it. Part of him wanted to walk away, to get in his truck and drive until Oak Ridge was nothing but a bad memory in his rearview mirror. But another part, the part that had spent 30 hours in a cell that reeked of bleach and despair, the part that had been slapped in open court while handcuffed and defenseless, needed to look Broadus in the eye one more time. 5 minutes, he said. The holding cell area was quiet now, empty except for Broadus in the last cell on the right. He sat on the metal bench, head in his hands, still wearing his uniform, though the badge and patches had been removed. He looked up when Babin approached, and something flickered across his face. Not quite fear, not quite regret, maybe recognition that the man he'd hunted was now the one holding all the cards. "Come to gloat?" Broadus's voice was rough, stripped of the swagger that defined him hours earlier. "Come to tell me I'm getting what I deserve?" "I'm not here to gloat. I'm here to tell you what happens next." "I know what happens next. Federal prison. I've been a cop for 15 years. I know what they do to cops inside." "You'll be in protective custody. Minimum security, most likely, given that you're cooperating." Babin's voice was flat, factual. "You'll serve between 15 and 20 years, depending on the plea deal your lawyer negotiates. When you get out, you'll be in your 60s, unemployable, broke, and marked as a felon for the rest of your life. Every job application, every apartment rental, every attempt to rebuild will be stamped with what you did here." Broadus looked away, his hands trembling slightly. We didn't think we were hurting anyone. They were just drifters, people passing through. Nobody important." "Nobody important." Babin repeated the words slowly, letting them hang in the air between them. "That warehouse has belongings from over 1,000 people, families, workers, veterans, people who trusted that the law would protect them and instead found predators wearing badges. You didn't just steal their property, Broadus. You stole their faith in a system that's supposed to be better than this."
Broadus's voice cracked. "I never meant for it to go this far. It started small, just confiscating drugs, keeping the cash. Then Reynolds brought up Sentinel, said we could make real money if we fed them inmates. It was supposed to be criminals, real criminals. But it's easier to invent criminals than find them. Easier to lie about a swerve or a smell or a swing that never happened. Easier to target people who won't fight back because they don't have the resources or the knowledge or the connections." Babin's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath. "I could have fought back, Broadus. When you kicked my legs apart on that roadside, I calculated exactly how long it would take to disarm you. Less than 2 seconds. I could have broken your wrist, taken your weapon, and disappeared before backup arrived. But I didn't, because I believed the system would work. I believed that someone, somewhere, would step in and stop this. But you had to call the Pentagon," Broadus said bitterly. "Had to use your connections, your rank. What about everyone else who came through here? They didn't have an admiral they could call." "No, they didn't, which is exactly why the federal government just deployed an entire task force to dismantle everything you built. Because those people deserved the same protection I got, and they didn't receive it. That's on you. That's on Reynolds. That's on every person in this town who knew what was happening and looked the other way." Babin paused, his eyes locked on Broadus. "You want to know the real tragedy? I'm not special. I'm just one man who happened to have the right phone number. The system should have protected all of them. The fact that it took a Navy SEAL to trigger federal intervention is an indictment of how broken things had become." Broadus had nothing to say to that. He sat on the bench, shoulders slumped, the weight of his choices finally settling on him like a physical thing. Outside the cell, footsteps echoed down the hallway, the transport team arriving to take him to Jackson. Babin stepped back from the bars. "You asked if I came to gloat. I didn't. I came to make sure you understood that this wasn't about me. This was about every person you and Reynolds victimized, every family you destroyed, every life you derailed for profit. You're going to prison, Broadus, not because you slapped me, but because you built a machine designed to chew up innocent people and spit out money. That's not law enforcement. That's predation, and predators eventually get hunted." He turned and walked away, leaving Broadus alone in the cell. Behind him, he heard the transport team arriving, heard the metallic clank of the cell door opening, heard Broadus being read his rights for federal transport. But Babin didn't look back. There was nothing more to see, nothing more to say. In the lobby, Creighton was waiting with Sarah, who looked shock-shelled but determined. "We're arranging transport back to your vehicle," the Admiral said. "It's been processed and cleared. Everything should be intact." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me, Master Chief. You did this. You kept your head, followed protocol, and gave us the opening we needed. A lot of people are going to get their lives back because you didn't lose yours in that cell." Creighton extended his hand. "The Medal of Honor ceremony is in 3 weeks. I expect to see you there." Babin shook his hand, the grip firm and brief. "Wouldn't miss it, sir." Sarah stepped forward, her public defender's bag clutched in her hands like a shield. "I don't know how to thank you for showing me that it's possible to fight back, that the system can work if you push hard enough. The system worked because people like you were already trying. You handed me your phone when you could have refused. You stood your ground when the judge tried to throw you out. Don't underestimate what that meant." She nodded, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "What will you do now?"
Babin thought about it. His truck was waiting. The road stretched out ahead, miles of asphalt leading away from Oak Ridge toward whatever came next. A ceremony in Washington, a medal he didn't feel like he'd earned, a future that felt simultaneously more certain and more fragile than it had before Ferguson Broadus's lights had appeared in his rearview mirror. "Drive," he said finally. "Just drive." He collected his belongings from the evidence room, wallet, keys, the smoothed-out invitation that would take him to the White House. His truck was parked in the lot, exactly where they'd recovered it, tank full courtesy of the federal government. He climbed into the cab, started the engine, and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, breathing in the familiar smell of leather and gasoline. Through the windshield, he could see the courthouse, lit up like a Christmas tree with portable lights and federal activity. News cameras captured every angle, agents moved with purpose, and somewhere inside, 23 people were being processed for release, their lives being given back one piece of paper at a time. Babin put the truck in gear and pulled out of the parking lot. In the rearview mirror, Oak Ridge grew smaller, the lights fading, the courthouse becoming just another building in just another town. But he knew it would be different now. The FBI would tear apart every case Reynolds had presided over. The state would investigate every arrest Broadus had made, and Sentinel Corrections would be shut down, its owners prosecuted, its victims compensated. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't enough, but it was something. And sometimes, in a world that felt increasingly designed to grind down anyone without power or connections, something was worth fighting for.
The road opened up ahead of him, dark and empty and full of possibility. Babin pressed the accelerator and let the miles fall away, carrying him toward Washington, toward a ceremony that would honor what he'd done overseas. But in his mind, the real honor was simpler. He'd driven through a trap, survived it, and dismantled it so that nobody else would have to. That was enough. That would always be enough. Behind him, Oak Ridge disappeared into the darkness, transformed from a predator's kingdom into just another exit on a highway that kept moving forward, always forward, toward something better.